and I showed it to Frank, because obviously I knew we needed to do some to generate some cash. He looked at it and picked it up and threw it in the nearest bin and then into the trash. And I was like, you can't do that. That cost me £12,000. And he said, well, all that's telling people is you're desperate. And he said, and the other thing is that process will take 6 months. We haven't got 6 months. Frank described me as being in a catatonic state when we met, because I had so much going on. There were so many things I needed to fix. I just didn't know which one to do first, right? And Frank came in and with his experience and said, right, we're going to do this, 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 this. And he came up with a brilliant plan. And I remember on the first day, I said to him, so Frank, what's the plan? He said, the plan is we're going to make decisions every day and we're going to execute on those decisions. And as long as we get more right than we get wrong, we'll be fine.
Hey, welcome to this week's episode of The Freedom Experience. I'm your host, John Moncrief, and today I'm talking to Bryan. Richard is a fellow coach, but he's also an entrepreneur and CEO who's gone through having to turn around the family business, a business that was doing 120 million in revenue, but was running at a 3.5 million loss. Richard took a call from his mother while he was in the States, and she basically said to him, look, Richard, your dad's not well. We need you to come home and we need you to take over the running of the business, or at least get involved in running the business. Richard's 28 years old. He gets back to England and he takes over the helm of the business to find out that they have a 5 million overdraft and that they are running at a 3.5 million loss. So our conversation today is about how Richard had to deal with some of the challenges to do with culture, how he went outside and he looked for a mentor to help him navigate the challenges that he was going to have to deal with, and how he put together a plan that ultimately over a period of 10 years turned the family business into something valuable that he was able to exit, and how Richard has now pivoted with his own family to getting involved in the property business. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed interviewing and chatting to Richard. Richard, welcome to the Freedom Experience podcast. Great to have you on today.
John, nice to be here.
Fantastic. So I thought just to start with, to give the listeners a little bit of background about where you come from, fourth generation family business, but maybe just tell us a little bit about your background to start with.
Yes, certainly. So I grew up in Bristol, England, in the southwest of England, and we had a family business. We were in the car business, so we had actually car and truck dealerships. And my story, the abridged version, is I grew up doing various jobs in the family business, in the holidays. So I knew my way around it. But then I went off to university in Scotland, and then I went to first came to the US in early, sort of 1993, 92, 93, and worked with Ford Motor Company for a couple of years. And that was a great period for me as a graduate trainee, working with Ford and also working with some very high performing dealers. And then I was there. I was in my mid-20s, and I got the distress call to come back to the family business. My father was sick, and we didn't really have any sort of defined succession plan. And although we had 16 family members who were shareholders, I was the only one that really had any automotive experience to speak of. And so I came back and joined the family business. And then by the time I was 28, I was running it. And just for context, it was $120 million in sales, 6 locations, 360 staff. That's the good news. The bad news is the year I joined, we just lost $3.5 million. We had a $5 million bank overdraft, and we had a lot of employees who were, I would say, entitled because of their length of service rather than focused on doing what was right for our customers. So it wasn't the best situation to walk into, and the bank were very close, I would say, to moving us into asset recovery. So it was precarious. Let's put it like that.
Were you in the US kind of training to move back into the family business? Was that the idea? So that made you the ideal candidate?
Yeah, so that was kind of the unofficial succession plan, is that I would go and work in the States because, there wasn't really anything happening in the UK at that time that we weren't doing that was different. And our main manufacturer, Ford Motor Company, was obviously US owned and very US centric. And so I think my father thought, well, it'd be good training and it would be easier to work with and in dealerships because I did some dealer placements over here. So I sold cars and, did the whole thing. And that would have been very difficult to do in my own family's business. It would have been tough for me, but also it would have been hard for example, my sales manager to be in that situation. So it's much better to go and do that elsewhere. But the plan was to be away for sort of 3 to 5 years. And that was obviously cut short when my father got sick. So yeah, it's just one of those things. But I would say it was a fantastic experience. And it really, I was fortunate that I worked with some of the top performing dealers in the United States. And so that gave me a vision of what success looked like, which was fantastic.
So you could bring that back. I mean, talking about vision, you come back to this business and it's in trouble in very short order. You are CEO of the business. What's your first move at that stage? What are you thinking and what's your first move?
Well, I remember the conversation with Tom, our bank manager, and he started off by congratulating me on becoming dealer principal and quickly
commiserations.
Quickly followed that by saying, I'd like to introduce you to our special team in London. And I said, Tom, do you mean asset recovery? And he was like, oh, well, that's another word for them. And I said, no, please don't do that, Tom. I've got a plan. I just need 6 months to implement it, and we'll pay down the overdraft. He looked a bit skeptical, but he did. He went back to HQ, and to be fair, they gave me 6 months. Now, I have to come clean and say I didn't have a plan, but I knew
that was my next question.
but I knew I needed one, and so I set out to find someone to help me because I knew at 28 that I didn't have the experience, but I also didn't really have the credibility with our bank and our manufacturer partners to run a $120 million business. And I'm sure actually with some of our staff at that point in time, because they'd worked for my family's business longer than I'd been alive. And so it was difficult, but I think probably the best thing I ever did was put ego to one side and say, look, I can work as hard as I like, but I'm not going to turn this thing around. And so I set out on a quest to find someone, and I'm very fortunate that I found the right man for the job. And although technically he worked for me, he was 58, I was 28. We shared an office for the next 2 years, and he really became my mentor, and I learned an awful lot from him. So that's what happened.
So did you make that decision quite quickly to bring somebody in? Was that almost sort of, yes, I've got a plan to the bank, and then in short order, that self-realization was there that I need to go and find somebody?
I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for, if I'm honest, but I think where I was fortunate is I just joined a CEO peer group. It's now called Vistage. At the time, it was called Tech in the UK. I think it's still called Tech in Canada, and stood for the Executive Club. And it was basically a group of CEOs, business owners that would meet once a month and have a full day. We'd have an outside speaker in the morning, and then we'd do member issues in the afternoon, and we sort of help each other and brainstorm. And I had the highest revenue in our group, but obviously with the lowest profit, and I was the youngest. But it was a lifesaver, really, because there are a lot of very smart people around the table, and I'm a massive fan of peer learning to this day. I think it's very powerful. And fortunately for me, one of our first meetings that I went to, we had an outside speaker from Heidrick and Struggles, the recruiter, and he was talking specifically about interim management and troubleshooters, and, for various different scenarios, whether it's succession planning or business turnaround or whatever. And so I grabbed him afterwards and said, look, I don't know if this person exists, but I need help. And I need it quickly. And this is the situation. And we met the following day and we sketched out what the role would look like. And, within 2 weeks, I was interviewing a short list of candidates. So, a bit of serendipity that he happened to be the speaker. But I kind of,
that point.
It's one of those things where once your radar is on and you're looking for something, you find the opportunity. So, the interesting thing is when I found Frank, which was not an easy process because I had to interview quite a few people before I found him, and he was a pretty unique individual, ex-special forces with a fine arts degree. So, but he had a very successful career in the automotive industry, and he had done turnarounds before. It was just a great fit, really. And so I came to the board of the family business, which included a couple of non-executive directors. One was an accountant and one was a lawyer. And said I found our man. I told them how much he was going to cost us. And they said, oh, no, he's far too expensive. We can't do that. We're going to, would turn it around by ourselves. I said, how's that going? Because not very well from what I can see.
Yeah. So you had to dig up that courage and just say, no, we're moving with.
I was much younger than everyone else in the room, but it was my family business and I was passionate about it. And I went to see my father in the hospital that night because the board were sort of pouring cold water on this idea. And I realized that he was the majority stockholder and had the casting vote, really, because at the end of the day he was still the owner, really. And so I said to him, look, here's my plan. I'm telling you now, this is the guy and this is our best option, and if we don't take him on, I'm leaving. And he looked at me and he said, you're not serious. And I said, no, I'm absolutely serious because I can't work any harder than working now, but this thing is going to go down in flames if we don't bring someone like this in. We need to do something radical. And if we don't do that, the bank are going to close us down. And I don't want to watch that happen. So he thought about it. The following day, he called me and said, leave the board to me. And we took Frank on, fired the non-executive directors. And
it sounds a bit like that Succession show, doesn't it?
Well, it was, the problem was the existing people had got so used to us losing money that was just the norm, and they were looking for incremental improvements, whereas I knew full well from my conversation with the bank that ship has sailed. We either do something radical to turn it around now or we're finished. So I look back on that to this day and think it's one of the smartest decisions I ever made to go and find Frank, because I got asked recently, do you think if you hadn't hired Frank, you could have turned it around? And I said, well, I'd have given it a good go, but I think we'd have run out of time and we'd have run out of cash. And he came in and encouraged me to do things that I wouldn't have done by myself, because he could just see it so clearly from the outside looking in, and he had the experience. I mean, one of the first things we did was close a loss-making truck dealership and lay off 70 people. And that is definitely not something I would have done, because some of them have worked for us for 35 years. So that was very difficult, but it gave us the cash when we sold the real estate, gave us the cash to pay down the overdrafts, show the bank that we were serious, and buy us some time. And I think if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have made it, quite honestly.
So, how far are you in at this point? You go out. The first thing you do is bring Frank in, and you described him as a hard-ass kind of coffee guzzling special forces.
Yeah.
The two of you get together. How far are you in, and what's the first move?
Well,
right now,
actually, the first move he made was I'd had a prospectus drawn up by Grant Thornton to try and sell the truck dealership that was losing money. And I think at the time that cost me, I mean, it's a long time ago, but £12,000 at the time to draw up this prospectus. And I showed it to Frank because obviously I knew we needed to do something to generate some cash. He looked at it and picked it up and threw it in the nearest bin and then into the trash. And I was like, you can't do that. That cost me £12,000. And he said, well, all that's telling people is you're desperate. And he said, and the other thing is that process will take 6 months. We haven't got 6 months.
Because you're now down to what, 4 months.
So it was, that's what I'm talking about, is like I'd have been trying desperately with an advisor to sell that business, and it wasn't saleable because it was losing money, had all the wrong people, had a weak franchise. There were so many things wrong with it that we didn't have time to turn it around. And so like Frank knew that, and I think that was very early days. So within the first 3 months we'd closed that dealership, and and one of the other things we did, and this was my idea actually, but Frank bought into it, is I said, look, no one, we talk a lot about open playing field and transparency in our sort of metronomics coaching practice, but no one knew the score. Like no one knew how bad things were because it was very secret. The only people who knew how much money we were losing was my father, our CFO, and me.
So it was very old school kind of, nobody knows what's going on at the top.
No. And so I said, we're going to make some radical decisions in a minute, and we need people to understand why we're doing that. And so we got people together, probably 25 at a time in our little conference room. And I did a quick presentation, which ended up with me showing them the numbers and explaining what that meant, and showing them our burn rate on cash, and just saying, listen, I am committed to doing everything I can to turn this business around. And that's why Frank's here to help me. But we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And I want to understand why we're going to be doing that. And that was a game changer, actually, because those that weren't committed left, which was fine by me. And some of our A players really stepped up, and then we were able to bring in some more A players to replace some of the B and C players that left. And so I think that was a pivotal moment in terms of showing everyone what the score was and why we needed to do the things that we were doing.
I'm curious, where were you drawing the confidence? You come and you're under a lot of pressure, and decisions have to be made very quickly. Is that something you're leaning on Frank a bit from, or did you just go in and feel that you had the confidence to make these decisions quickly? Because some of them sound like they were made very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's what I said. We probably wouldn't have made it because I wouldn't have made decisions quick enough. Frank described me as being in a catatonic state when we met. Because I had so much going on. There were so many things I needed to fix. I just didn't know which one to do first, right? And Frank came in and with his experience and said, right, we're going to do this, 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 this. and he came up with a brilliant plan, and we just, and I remember on the first day I said to him, "So Frank, what's the plan?" He said, "The plan is we're going to make decisions every day and we're going to execute on those decisions, and as long as we get more right than we get wrong, we'll be fine." And I said,
So we're gonna make some mistakes, but
yeah.
as long as we're
I remember
yeah.
thinking, God, I'm paying him all this money, and that's what he comes up with. But what he did was he upped the tempo. He upped the tempo, and we started making a lot of decisions very quickly. And I remember a month into Frank being there with me, we had done a lot, and we had a monthly review with the bank, and the guy came in, he could not believe it. He said, "You've done more in the last month than you've probably done in the last 3 years," because we just started making decisions, and we made some mistakes along the way, but quite honestly, that was just collateral damage, because the main thing was to get the momentum of moving forwards, and we did anything we could to generate cash as well, because cash was the most important thing for us. Profit was not that important in the short term. It was cash.
It sounds like you found your way to some of the fundamentals that you use in the coaching work that you do at the moment. So I'm thinking kind of great game of business, open book, metronomics type things. Did you actually, was there a conscious decision to look for a system, or did you, based on Frank's experience and your intuition, kind of start to just do these things?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have had a system and a plan at that point. I mean, we created our own plan, but we actually did create a one-page plan, which I got from being in Vistage at that time. And so we had a one-page plan showing all our priorities, and we updated that on a monthly basis. But and we shared that with the leadership team. And one of the other things that I talk about momentum, it was about tempo as well. So Frank was a Scot, and one of my favorite moments is, again, probably during his first week, I'm showing him around one of the dealerships, and there's this meeting room, and these people are in there, and there's coffee cups and biscuit wrappers and stuff. They've obviously been in there a while, and they're sort of lounging around in their chairs. Frank opens the door, because you could see into this meeting room, and he says, "Gentlemen, can someone tell me what this meeting is about?" And I think someone sheepishly said, "Oh, it's about the customer satisfaction in the service area," or something. It was kind of random. And Frank said, "And how long has this meeting been going on?" And it was a long time. And they said, like, a couple of hours or something. And he looked and he said, "Gentlemen, this meeting is over. Please go back to work." And as we're walking away, he looked at me and he said, "Right, that's one of the first things we're going to do, is no meeting lasts longer than an hour. And if we can get it done in a half an hour, so much the better." And we used to have a weekly managers meeting with our sort of senior leadership team, and Frank would just shut the book at an hour and walk out.
And that was it.
Yeah.
Oh.
And a lot of our meetings were standing up briefings. We used to have, regular briefings that were fantastic. And if you wanted tea or coffee, you better turn up with it already made, because there wasn't time to waste. And it's kind of back to what we do in terms of, daily huddles. And there was a lot of that, but our huddles were stand-up meetings. And we actually got these tables in that we could stand up at. And then we started doing team briefing, where we would cascade the messages down through to the departments, so the front line actually understood what was going on and why. And we started a newsletter, and we actually, we realized it was very important to communicate, in fact, over communicate what we were doing and why, if we wanted people to be with us. And it was a massive culture change, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why some people just left, because they couldn't handle it, because it turned things on their heads. I mean, things had been plodding along at quite a slow rate, and suddenly everything was moving a lot quicker. And I think that was key to our success, to be honest.
Were you just over communicating that vision all the time, just kind of reinforcing it? And this is where we're going. That's
Yeah.
the future.
Yeah. And we had our short-term goals, and then we had our longer-term goals. And and we were just trying to get people to buy into the fact that, we had one of our, we had a mission statement and a vision, and our vision was that we would have the best customer satisfaction for the brands that we represented in the UK.
Because you weren't very good at that when you took over, right?
And,
It was really
yeah,
bad.
which actually, I remember when we first put it out there, I'm sure people are like, what are they talking about? Because our customer satisfaction was horrible. And it was, that should have been giving us feedback on how we were doing. I think we were 250th in the country out of like 300 dealers.
Wow.
And then by the time we sold it 10 years later, we were in the top 10. So,
So you've changed the culture.
Yeah.
You've brought in A players. The meetings aren't as long and things are starting to move in the right direction. And how do you hold on to the good people that you brought in?
Well, and I think one of the things that Frank said that stuck with me was, we're going to change people or change people. Like, they're either going to change their mindset very quickly, or they're not the right people. And that's where he was very decisive. And I know you and I have spoken before about the importance of like not hanging on to the C players.
Yeah.
And we had some of the worst type of C players. I had a guy in sales who sold a lot of cars, but was a complete prima donna. So didn't buy into the company culture or values or anything. It was all about him. And I remember when I fired him, how shocked everyone was, because he also generated a lot of collateral damage for other departments and customer complaints. And so I ended up firing him, and there was just shock, because they were like, well, he sells a lot of cars, but it was bigger than that. It was about...
But he was toxic as well.
Was completely. And actually, the interesting thing is, after he left, everyone else's sales came up, and our customer satisfaction improved, and it's just the right thing to do. So
don't be scared of letting go of those C players or those toxic players. And
he was the worst kind because he felt he was fireproof, because he sold a lot of vehicles and been there a long time, but he was absolutely disastrous for the business. And one of the ways that we kept our A players is we started getting rid of people like that, who felt they were fireproof but were either not performing or had a terrible attitude and were not team players. And we were pretty decisive about getting rid of those people. And I think that gave a lot of encouragement to our A players, and that's why they stayed, because they're like, oh, they mean business. If they're prepared to do that, this is great. Because
we're building a winning team.
Yeah,
these guys are saying, yeah.
And we brought in some fantastic people as well. So I inherited a team of 12 leaders, senior leaders for the different dealerships. And when I sold the business 10 years later, there were only 2 that were the same. So, it was quite a change, really.
When you talk about selling 10 years later, did you go in and kind of have that 10-year thinking that we talk about? Was that there at that?
No, not initially. Initially it was all about survival. It was just about saving the business. But once we got through the first 2 years, which is when Frank left from being there on a sort of full-time basis, my apprenticeship was done, he said. And so I was CEO in my own right from that point without Frank there. Frank was on the board for a while, but then then I just carried on, and we added new franchises and we grew the business. But at that 2-year point, Frank and I did have conversations about selling the business, and the goal was to sell it by the time I was 40.
Okay, so you're now what, about 30 at that 2-year point?
Yeah.
Because 28, about 30. Okay.
To grow it and sell it by the time I was 40, and we actually sold it when I was 38. So,
So almost 10 years from the day you came in.
Yeah.
But you get to 30 and you're starting to think about succession. And when we started this call, before we hit the record button, we were talking about a stat, which was around 65 odd percent of businesses in the US do not have a proper succession plan, if I've got that right.
Yes, yeah. If you look at, I think it was in May of 2024, there's some research by JP Morgan. They did a survey and looking at family owned and privately held businesses in the United States. And the stat was 65% of them did not have a robust succession plan, which is a succession plan in writing that is well communicated. And if you've got that, you are definitely in the minority. And we certainly didn't have a plan initially. And I think when you're looking at succession planning, you have to think more about a culture of succession rather than just looking at the CEO, which is what a lot of people do.
Yeah.
You need to look at all the key positions in the business and say, well, who's next in line and what are we doing to develop them? And by the way, do they know that they're next in line? Because that's a fantastic retention tool. If I say to you, Jean, we see a lot of potential in you. We think you could run this division in the future, and we want to work with you to put a plan together to make sure that you're ready. I mean, that's someone else can come in and offer you more money in the short term. But if you know you've got that plan and that development and that clear path forwards, you're pretty unlikely to leave, actually. So I think it's good for the business in a lot of ways. It's a disaster recovery plan if something happens to your senior leadership. It's also a retention plan for your A players, and it's just good for the business. And we identified that with our department managers. So if you think of a car dealership, you've got sales, service, parts, all the different departments. We looked at it and we said, well, actually, our managers are out of the business for on average 6 weeks a year with vacation, meetings with
Yeah.
manufacturers, training, etc. And so that is a great opportunity for someone else to step up and run the show while they're out. I mean, if you look at our wholesale parts operation, we had 400 customers who were everything from different independent repairers, accident repair centers, the whole thing. And that was a big business in its own right. I mean, that was probably a 5-6 million pound business. But we gave the opportunity for the number two to step up and run it for 6 weeks a year, which is fantastic because I think you have to accept that when you're doing that, they're going to make mistakes or they're going to do things differently.
Yeah.
And as long as you set it up that when the number one, the manager comes back, you sit down and you have a debrief. How did it go? What went well? What didn't go well? What would you do differently? And we used to do that with the manager, the number two, and HR. And sometimes I'd sit in on it and we'd just have a chat. And it wasn't in a way of we're going to beat you up for making the mistakes that you made. It was like, what would you do differently? And it was a fantastic learning opportunity. And it changed the culture. And we got big into learning and development, and everyone in the company had a disc profile, for example. And that was a massive revolution because I remember a sales manager saying to me, this stuff's all mumbo jumbo. And I said, really? I said, there's my profile. Take that home and read it tonight and tell me what you think tomorrow. He came in the next day and he said, oh, these things are pretty accurate then. I was like, yeah, they're accurate. And so everyone knew their disc profile, everyone knew their colors. And that was, I mean, we were, in the 90s, we were sort of, there weren't too many other dealerships doing that.
I can imagine not, no.
So
Yeah.
it actually was really fun. Once we got back into profit and we were able to build the business back up again, then it was super fun. And when you're making some profit and you've got some new franchises that are strong franchises, you've got a bit of wind in your sails, then it's kind of easy to attract A players then.
So you get everything back on an even keel. You're kind of moving into being profitable again. Your wife is from Colorado. You're obviously thinking about succession. You're starting to move leaders into those roles. I'm guessing. How did you think about succession in terms of exiting completely, or kind of keeping, because you had 16 family shareholders? I mean, there must have been quite a lot going through your mind about how to do that as you got to that point.
Yeah, and I actually bought some of them out early on because they lived in some lived in the UK, some lived in Canada. I mean, they really were all over the place, and some of the older shareholders, they'd get a dividend or distribution, and when Frank and I were doing our plan and had to tell them we were out of cash and there were no more distributions, you can imagine that didn't go down very well. So once we started making profits again, I was able to have conversations with them and say, look, there's a choice. It's not really, I don't really want to pay any distributions out because I want to reinvest that to grow the business, any cash we have.
So you were very intentional about that. The money's going back in. We need to grow this business.
Absolutely. But but I also recognize that if you're in your 70s and you're a shareholder in this business, and really the only benefit you get is the distributions at that point, if you're living in Canada, then there's a conflict of interest. And so, I also realized that as a shareholder, managing director, and a trustee, I had a conflict of interest. And so what we did was we bought out some of the initial shareholders. And once I got to 50%, which meant that I had control, then we disbanded the trusts and we issued out the shares so that people own those shares in their own right. And that made it easier for people to decide whether they were staying or going, quite honestly. And then we got to a point where I made an offer to buy everyone out. And, I mean, there was some risk in that because I had to borrow quite a lot of money to do it. And the business was profitable, but still marginal. But I was betting on myself to actually grow the business. And so we got to that stage and we went from initially 16 down to 7 shareholders, and then 7 down to 2, which was just my wife and I.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and so that was quite a journey. Actually, that was took a long time, a lot of advice, and a lot of negotiation with family members, which is always fun.
I can imagine.
So that was going on in the background, and that was the sort of ownership challenge, because I knew, I mean, I didn't actually know when I wanted to sell the business, but I knew the likelihood is at some point I would sell it.
So you were conscious of preparing the business, getting everything in order, making sure that
it wasn't really when the opportunity arose, but there was no real definitive time frame on it. In fact, it happened a lot quicker than I was expecting, to be honest. So,
but you were ready at that stage. You'd done the work that when that opportunity came along, you could change. And what you've done ultimately is just sort of pivoted. So still a family business in a way, because your son is now involved. And
so my wife and I, and my son is now a director as well. And we have a property business. We do commercial real estate, and until recently we were doing a residential development, but now we're focused on just the commercial side of things. And it's been interesting. So my son has his own career, but he's now 26. My daughter graduated from college this year, and she started her first job, and so next year she'll probably become a director as well. And for them at that point, that means that quarterly they have to attend a virtual meeting, a board meeting, where we review the numbers and strategy, and so that's part of their education.
Yes,
and then
which is very good. Yeah.
So that we're making them aware of what we do and how we do it. And then at some point in the future, that's also part of our transition plan, and it's also part of our disaster recovery plan, because my wife and I travel quite a lot together, and if anything happened to us,
If it happens, yeah.
yeah, I'd we have trusts and everything set up, but I'd want my children to understand what it means to be a business owner, and to make the right choices, because what I don't want to try and do is map out their lives for them. I want them to have their own lives, but the way the trusts are written is they can, by the time they're 30, they can be trustees in their own right. So in other words, they can make whatever decision they want about the business. And if my wife and I weren't around, hopefully we're still going to be here, but
hopefully you're still there. Yeah.
But I think that's important, that you have a
Yeah.
long-term succession plan of where you'd like to go, and you start with the end in mind and work backwards from that. But I think you also need to be mindful that bad things happen to good people every day, and you need to have a bit of a disaster recovery plan for your key people, especially when it comes to your CEO, because that can really derail a business quickly.
Last couple of questions.
Yes.
You talked about, I think, certain laws in your book, if I remember the term correctly. If you were giving a bit of advice to business owner now, what was number one out of those laws? I mean, was it number one, or is there one particularly that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've found over the last 25 years is that I don't even know if it's one of my it's probably contained in some of those leadership lessons in the book, but is to not be afraid of surrounding yourself with people that are smarter than you are.
Very good.
When I came into that business, I had my first meeting when I became dealer principal. I had my first meeting with my senior team, and I came home and my wife said, "How was that?" And it was an emotional time for me, because my dad was in hospital and all that going on as well, and was really very unwell. And I said, "Well, I'm not sure they're that excited to have a new boss who's only 28." And but the scariest thing is, I think I'm the smartest person in the room, and that terrifies me, because I'm not that smart. And fast forward to when we sold the business, and I mean, that's not fair, because I had a guy called Mike who was really great, but aside from Mike, I was looking around the table thinking, this is not good. And fast forward 10 years, I came home and my wife said, how was that? And we had a meeting in the same room, and I said, well, it was obviously pretty emotional, but the best thing about it is I'm pretty sure I'm the dumbest person in the room.
So the whole thing had flipped over.
Yeah, because I think my superpower was actually convincing really smart people to come and work for me, because I'd promised them that I wasn't going to micromanage them, and that I knew they were good at what they did because I'd done my research, and that we were building a terrific team. And that became a lot of fun, actually, building that team. And once you've got those people surrounding you, it's a challenge because they're all so smart, but it's also really fun.
Just talking about building that fantastic team, when you sold and you did your exit, was there a time off that you lost that sense of purpose, or would you already sort of, was there a bit of a dip?
In theory, I was, a consultant for a bit after I left, which meant I just had to come in and do intros between manufacturers or finance companies and the new ownership. But that didn't take very long, and it was really very much part-time. And I definitely lost my mojo that year. Like the year we sold the business, I had no purpose. I had no team around me, and we had money in the bank, which was nice. But it was not a particularly. Everyone has this view of when you sell the business, it's going to be a euphoric event. For me, and I've spoken to other people that have sold their businesses that had a similar experience, it was a case of relief, number one, because it's quite a long and drawn out process selling the business, followed by lack of identity. Like, who am I now?
Yeah.
And it probably took me 12 months to get that back, until I started the property business. And even then I was still feeling my way. And that's part of the reason that we came to the US for a sabbatical for 12 months. That that ended up. I'm now here full time, and I've lived here for 14.
You never left.
But I think that's important, and I do a lot of work with business owners on, when we're talking about succession, is actually thinking about what their future looks like when they do step away. Are they going to step away completely? Are they going to have some sort of consultant role? Are they going to stay on the board?
And you're helping them
And
set themselves up. Yeah.
setting themselves up by developing other interests and other avenues and things that they can step into, because it's very difficult to go from working in an environment that's very I don't want to say high pressure, but is all encompassing, and you're very focused and you're used to being busy, and suddenly everything goes away. It's actually quite traumatic. And so that sense of loss I felt quite keenly after I sold the business.
I guess just kind of closing, one last thought or question. The name of the podcast is The Freedom Experience. What does freedom mean to you?
I have a friend in the UK who's a very successful entrepreneur, business owner, and we talked about this recently, and he said to me, freedom to me means being able to stay in bed longer in the morning if I want to, because I know that my business is doing just fine. In other words, he set the business up that he adds to it when he's there, but it runs just fine without him. And I think
Love it.
A lot of people talk about work-life balance. For me, it's about having the freedom to choose what I'm doing. And that is very powerful. Like, I'm in control of my own calendar. I have my own business. I choose my own clients I work with. And I think that's very liberating. And you can also choose then how you spend your time away from work, because I want, for myself and for my clients, to have a great business, but also to have a great life. And I don't believe the two are mutually exclusive. You just have to have the mindset that you're going to do both, right?
Love it. And talking of time and your time, thank you so much for giving me the time. I will put your book, your link, all the links to everything in the show notes so that people know where to find you. But thank you very much for giving me some of your time, Richard.
John, always a pleasure chatting to you. Great to see you this morning.
You too.